Myra opened her eyes to red light and smoke, and her head was spinning, and her heart was beating like a drum. And everything around her was shaking and hot and broken and wrong. She was still strapped to a seat, and the ship was not moving anymore. But it was not right, because the walls were cracked and wires were hanging, and small fires were burning across the floor. She pressed the buckle and the belt snapped open, and she fell to the floor and landed on her side, and her arm hurt. But she pushed herself up and tried to stand, and almost fell again. Her legs were weak, and the air was thick with smoke, and the lights above her flickered like dying stars, and the ship was too quiet now, and that was not a good thing, because silence meant something bad had happened. She looked around for the others, but the other seats were empty, and the back door was open, and only darkness waited outside, and she could hear the wind howling like a warning. Mira grabbed the emergency bag and a small scanner and pulled a mask over her face and walked to the open door and stepped out into a strange world that looked cold and quiet and endless. The ground was purple like sand, but it moved like mist, and the sky above was red and cracked with dark clouds, and everything felt like it was waiting for something. She walked slowly, because the ground was soft and cold, and she could see tall trees like frozen bones and dark hills like sleeping monsters, and not a sound came from the land except the whisper of wind. Then she saw them. At first, she thought they were statues, or maybe broken machines left by another ship, but as she got closer, she saw that they were girls, or at least they looked like girls. They stood in a wide circle in the middle of a clearing, and they were all different in size and shape, but they had the same glowing skin, and long silver hair, and eyes that were open but empty. They were not moving, not breathing, not speaking, and they looked like they had been frozen in place like dolls placed on display, and the way they stood made it feel like they were waiting. Mira stopped walking and looked at them for a long time and felt a strange chill run down her back, and the scanner in her hand gave soft clicks, but no real reading came through, and that made no sense. They were not dead but not alive, and that was the only thing she could think of, and she did not know what to do next. She moved closer to one of the girls who had her hand stretched out like she had been reaching for something, and Mira raised her own hand without thinking and reached back slowly. Her fingers touched the alien girl's palm, and in that moment, something changed. A jolt of heat ran through Mira's arm and shot into her chest, and her legs gave out and she dropped to the ground, and her vision turned white for a second, and her ears rang with a strange sound. It was like a voice, but not a real voice, and more like a thought that did not belong to her, and it said, "One has awake," gasped for breath, and crawled back from the girl, and held her head, and the scanner now gave a sharp beep, and her hands were shaking, and her heart felt like it was being pulled in two. The alien girl had not moved at all, and still stood with her eyes open and her hand raised, but something was different now. Something was wrong. Myra looked around and saw the rest of the girls, and they were still frozen in place. But the wind felt colder now, and the sky darker, and the forest around her seemed to hold its breath. She backed away from the circle and looked for a safe place, and found a small hill with a flat spot, and set up her emergency tent, and sat inside and wrapped herself in a thermal blanket. Her hands still shook, and her head hurt, and the voice still echoed in her mind, and she stared at the scanner and watched it blink with unreadable signals and strange pulses. She opened her bag and found a ration bar and chewed it without taste, and drank a little water and looked out at the circle again, and the girls still stood there like before, but now she felt something else, something inside her that had changed, and she knew that this place was not safe, and this crash was not an accident, and she was not alone anymore. The silence was not normal, it was waiting, and the frozen girls were not asleep. They were something else, something ancient and strange and maybe dangerous. Mira did not know what had started, but she felt deep inside that she had touched something she should not have, and now the world was watching her, and the next move was hers, and if she chose wrong, she would die, just like the others who came before her, and maybe these girls would die too, but if she chose right, then maybe, just maybe, she could survive on. Maybe she could save them. Asterisk. The red sun rose slowly over the alien hills, and the light touched the sleeping forest, and the mist began to melt away, and Myra stepped out of her tent with tired eyes and heavy feet. She had not slept well, and her dreams were full of strange lights and soft voices and shadows that reached for her from far away, and she felt like her body was awake, but her mind was still floating. The air was cold but not sharp, and the wind had stopped, and everything was too quiet again, and that silence wrapped around her like a blanket she could not throw off. She looked toward the circle where the alien girl stood, and her heart skipped a beat because something was different, and it took her a few seconds to understand what her eyes were seeing. One of the girls was no longer standing. She had fallen to the ground, and her silver hair spread like threads of light across the purple grass, and her skin was not glowing now, but had turned gray and thin and cold, like old stone. Mira ran toward her and dropped to her knees and touched her shoulder, and it was like touching ice that had been dead for years, and her fingers pulled back quickly like they had touched something cursed. The girl's eyes were open but empty in a different way than before, and her mouth was half open, as if she had tried to say something before the end came. The other girls were still standing in place, just like before, with the same blank eyes and silent faces, but now they felt more like statues than living beings, and Mira could feel a cold tension around her. She pulled out her scanner and aimed it at the body, and the device gave a long low beep, and the screen showed a reading she had not seen before, and it flashed in red, and it said cellular collapse complete. That meant death, real death. She looked at the data again and again, but the numbers were not changing, and her stomach twisted, because she knew that whatever had kept these girls frozen was now broken, and she knew it was her fault. The voice from yesterday came back in her mind like an echo from a deep well, and it said again, "One has awakened." Was that girl the one she had touched? Was that why she had fallen? Myra stood up and looked around, and nothing moved, but everything felt like it was watching her. And the silence was no longer just quiet, it was sharp like glass. She walked back to her camp and sat with her back against a rock and stared at the forest and the sky and the broken girl, and her thoughts spun in circles. The ship was gone, and her crew was gone, and now she was stuck on a planet full of sleeping alien girls who might die just because she had touched one of them. Her fingers still remembered the heat from that first contact, and her chest still felt strange, like her heartbeat was not only hers anymore. She opened her bag and pulled out her AI core, which was still flickering with weak light, and she connected it to the scanner and whispered, "Come on, give me something." The AI blinked twice and spoke in a soft, broken voice, and it said, "Foreign network detected, low-level psychic field confirmed, partial merge with user." Likely Mira stared at it and said again, "What do you mean, merge?" And the AI answered, "Connection through skin-to-skin contact may have triggered a partial link with the alien network." She did not understand all of it, but the meaning was clear enough. She had touched something ancient, and now she was inside it, and it was inside her. And something had started because of that. The AI continued and said, "If the network is breaking, the subjects may lose stability one by one, resulting in death of all linked entities." Mira felt her throat tighten, and she looked back at the standing girls, and her eyes stopped on the one closest to the dead girl, and she stared for a long time, because something was wrong. Again, that girl's fingers were trembling just a little, just enough to be seen. Mira rushed back to the circle and stood in front of her and watched as the girl's lips moved ever so slightly, and then stopped, and her body became still again. But Mira had seen it, and now she was sure this was not over, and more would follow, and maybe all of them would fall, unless she found a way to stop it. She sat beside the fallen girl and whispered, "I am sorry. I did not mean to break you," and her voice cracked, because she had never felt so alone before, not even in set. Wind picked up again, and blew through the trees, and carried soft sounds like tiny whispers, and they sounded like a song sung by ghosts, and the sky turned a little darker. Myra closed her eyes and let the sounds enter her mind, and for a second, she felt like she was not sitting on alien grass, but standing in a hall of light, with voices all around her. Then the image was gone, and she was back on the cold ground with a dead alien beside her, and her hands shaking, and her mind full of fear and strange questions. She looked at the scanner one last time, and it showed something new, just one word in red, connected asterisk. Mira did not remember falling asleep, but she woke with her head resting on her arm, and the soft dirt beneath her cheek was warm like breath, and the wind whispered round her like a voice she almost knew. She blinked slowly and looked up, and for a moment the world was different, and everything glowed with a soft light, and the forest shimmered, and the sky looked golden and full of floating shapes that danced above the trees. She was not herself, or maybe she was, but not alone, and she stood in a city made of glass, and wind and laughter filled the air like music, and tall towers touched the clouds, and people walked with joy in their eyes. They were not human, but they were beautiful and peaceful, and full of something Mira could not name, and she felt their joy inside her chest, like a warm river, and she walked with them, like she belonged. Then the light cracked, and the sky turned black, and fire fell from the clouds, and the towers broke, and screams replaced the music, and the people ran, but there was no escape, and Mira felt a pain that did not come from her body. She turned and saw one of the alien girls, holding out her hand, and her mouth moved, but no sound came, and her eyes were full of fear, and the dream shattered into a million pieces. Mira gasped and sat up, and her heart was pounding, and her skin was cold, and her clothes were wet with sweat, and her hands trembled as she touched her face and checked the scanner beside her. The screen flashed with strange symbols and new signals, and the word resonance kept blinking again and again, and the time showed She had been unconscious for almost 6 hours. She looked at the circle and counted the girls, and her breath caught in her throat because now 2 were lying on the ground, and their faces were gray, and their eyes were dry, and lifeless. Another one was Gunmyra, stood slowly and walked toward them, and the second girl had fallen with her hand over her chest like she had tried to hold her heart together, and Mira felt her own chest tighten. She kneeled beside her and whispered, "I am sorry. I do not know how to stop it," and her voice cracked and her throat ached, and she felt like the forest was pressing down on her from all sides. Then she heard Ita whisper, not from the trees, not from the wind, but from inside her head. And it was soft and distant, like a memory that did not belong to her, and it said, "Help." Mira froze and looked around, but nothing had moved, and no one was there, and the girls were still silent, and the sky above was heavy with dark clouds, and the forest watched without eyes. The voice came again, "Help me find the core. The core is broken, and we are fading." And Mira felt a tear fall down her cheek, because she knew now that they were still alive inside, but they were trapped in a web she did not understand, and that web was breaking, and every hour more of them would fall, and if she did nothing, then they would all die, and maybe she would. Too, she ran back to her bag and pulled out her AI core and plugged it into a scanner and whispered, "Show me everything about the network." And the AI hummed and blinked and started to work. It said, "Psychic link confirmed. Low signal range, emotional memory transfer detected." Subject: Mira is now partially bound to the neural pattern of the dormant network. She stared at the words and asked, "How do I fix it?" And the AI paused and then answered, "Unknown, must locate origin. Point of network control, possibly a central mind core or resonance beacon." Mira took a deep breath and whispered, "Then I will find it." And she stood up and looked at the horizon and saw a faint shape in the distance, like a tall tower wrapped in shadow, and she knew that was her next step. But before she could move, she felt a wave of cold pass through her, and she dropped to one knee and clutched her head as new images crashed into her mind. This time she saw a great machine pulsing with blue light, and dozens of girls standing in a circle around it, and their hands raised and their minds joined, and the machine humming like a song. Then the image turned dark, and the light faded, and the machine stopped, and one by one the girls fell, and the silence returned, and the song was gone. Mira opened her eyes, and the scanner buzzed again, and the word "surge" flashed across the screen, and the forest lights dimmed for a second like the planet itself had shivered. She knew she was running out of time, and she also knew the next death was not far. She turned back to the circle, and saw another girl's hand twitch just a little, and her lips moved in silence, and Mira whispered, "I hear you, I will try. I promise." The forest wind picked up again, and carried with it a sound like a sigh, and maybe it was the planet, or maybe it was the souls of those still dreaming. But Mira felt something shift inside her, and the fear became purpose, and the silence became a call, and she would follow it to the end, if it meant giving everything. Mira walked through the silent forest with slow, careful steps, and the air around her felt heavy, like a blanket soaked in cold water, and each breath she took felt like pulling ice into her lungs. Behind her, the circle of alien girls waited without motion, and the 2 lifeless ones lay still and gray and quiet, like forgotten statues in a garden that no one visits anymore. The scanner in her hand pulsed slowly with dim blue light, and the AI core inside whispered data in short, soft tones, like it was trying not to wake the trees. Ahead of her was the hill she had seen in her dream, and at the top she could now see something hidden beneath vines and roots and stone, and it looked like a door, or maybe a hatch. Covered by time, she climbed the hill with hands and knees and fingers digging into the earth, and she reached the hatch and brushed the vines away and found a circle of metal, glowing faintly with alien symbols that shimmered when touched. She pressed her palm against the center, and the metal grew warm, and a voice entered her mind again, but this one was not soft or scared. It was old and deep, and it said only 2 words: "Access granted." The ground below her trembled, and the hatch split open with a low groan, and a soft light shone from beneath the earth, and Mira took a breath and climbed down into the dark. The tunnel below was made of smooth silver walls that pulsed with slow waves of light, and the air was warm and full of a hum that felt like it came from deep inside the planet. Mira moved carefully and followed the light until she reached a small round chamber with a platform in the middle, and floating above it was a crystal the size of her head, glowing with blue fire. The AI core beeped, and her scanner displayed lines of code, too fast to read, and then slowed and stopped on one phrase: "Alien memory node detected, translation possible." She whispered yes, and the scanner flashed, and the crystal pulsed, and then the walls of the chamber filled with images made of light and color and sound like a dream made real. She saw the planet long ago, green and full of life, and the alien girls smiling and singing and building towers of light, that floated above the trees, and their voices made the sky shimmer then. She saw the warning, a red light in the sky, a signal. They could not understand a storm coming from beyond the stars, and they prepared for it the only way they could. They built a sleep system, a great web of mind and memory, and they linked their thoughts into one, and placed their dreams into crystals like this one, and waited for the danger to pass. The danger did not come right away, and years passed, and their world stayed quiet, and the sleepers stayed safe, but time kept moving, and something inside the web began to break. One node failed, and then another, and their memories began to rot like fruit left too long in the sun. And when Mira touched the girl in the circle, she had triggered a pulse that began a collapse. She saw it all through their eyes, the code of life that held them together, breaking down bit by bit like a thread pulled loose from a cloth until the whole thing began to fall apart. The voice returned, and it was the same one from before, and it said, "Only the living spark can repair the chain. The spark must bond with the root." And Myra whispered, "What is the spark?" The answer came not in words but in feeling, and she knew it meant her. The bond had already started when she touched the girl, and now she was inside the system just enough to act. The scanner beeped again, and showed a second phrase. Location of main core. Unknown signal. Faint possible beacon. East quadrant coordinates loading. And Mira felt a new wave of fear mixed with hope. She climbed out of the chamber, and the hatch closed behind her. And the light faded, and the hill was quiet again, and the wind had picked up, and the trees whispered her name in voices that sounded like memory. She ran back to the camp, and looked at the circle, and saw that another girl had fallen, and her body lay in the grass like a broken candle, with light gone forever. Three were gone now, and Myra fell to her knees, and placed her hand on the girl's arm, and whispered, "I found something, and I will not let you all fade, I swear it." The scanner pulsed with a soft tone, and the map appeared, and the beacon blinked on the far side of the forest beyond the hills, where the sky was darker, and the air smelled like storm. She packed her bag and took one last look at the circle, and said, "I will come back," and then she turned and walked toward the dark edge of the world, where the path would begin. The girls behind her remained still, but now the silence felt different, like they were watching, not with eyes, but with hope. And, for the first time, Myra did not feel alone. The sky was no longer red, but deep gray, and the wind was not gentle anymore, and it screamed through the branches, like something angry had woken from its sleep, and now wanted to speak. Myra moved quickly through the trees with her scanner pressed close to her chest, and her bag bouncing on her back and her boots crunching on the cold purple grass that curled at her steps. Behind her the circle was growing smaller and smaller, and she did not want to look back, because she knew more might fall while she was away, and if she turned now she might not go forward again. The beacon signal pulsed in her hand, and the screen showed a faint blue dot far ahead, and the word unstable flashed again, and the AI whispered, "Proximity growing, prepare for unknown activity." The forest changed as she moved deeper, and the trees grew taller and twisted, and their bark was black like ash, and their roots moved beneath her like snakes, hiding from the light. The air was thicker, and her breath came slower, and each step felt like walking through a dream that was turning into a nightmare. And her heart beat hard inside her ribs, like a hammer without rhythm. Then she heard it not. A voice, not a whisper, not the song of memory, but something else, something heavy and slow, and full of hunger, and it came from somewhere ahead and below, and it made the scanner shake. She stopped and crouched behind a wide root and listened, and the sound came again, a deep growl, mixed with the crack of breaking wood, and the low scrape of something dragging itself across the ground. The AI whispered, "Warning, life form approaching mass. Unknown energy spike detected, high threat probability, avoid contact." Mira held her breath and crawled forward and peeked over a hill and saw something moving between the trees, and her blood turned cold, because it was not like the alien girls, and not like any beast from Earth. It was tall and thin, and its skin looked like vines wrapped around bones, and its eyes glowed yellow with no pupils, and its arms were long and ended in sharp hooks that scraped against the stone. It moved without sound, and its head turned slowly left and right, like it was listening with more than ears, and its chest pulsed with green light that flickered in patterns like broken signals. Mira slid back behind the root and closed her eyes and counted slowly, and tried to think, and her hands shook, and she knew that if it saw her, there would be no chance to run. The voice returned in her mind again, faint but clear, and it said, "That is the woken one, left behind by the rupture. It hunts the spark, it smells the link." She opened her eyes and whispered, "Then it knows I am here," and the wind carried her words like smoke. Through the trees the creature let out a hiss, and turned its head toward her, and the forest fell still like the world had paused, and then it began to move faster and faster toward her. Mira stood and ran, and the forest blurred around her, and branches scratched her face, and her breath came sharp and her feet slipped on wet moss, and behind her, the sound grew louder and closer. She jumped over a log and slid down a slope and fell into a shallow pool, and the water splashed into her mouth and burned like metal, and she crawled out choking and coughing and kept running. The scanner beeped wildly, and the AI shouted, "Unknown surge, approaching target movement required," and the map blinked and the beacon flashed. Just ahead, just a little farther then, she saw a tall spire rising from the ground covered in vines, and glowing faintly with blue lines that pulsed like veins, and the air around it shimmered like heat, and the sound of humming filled her ears. She ran to the base and found a door half open, and slipped inside just as the creature reached the edge of the clearing, and let out a roar that shook the walls of the tower inside. It was dark but quiet, and the walls glowed faintly, and Mira dropped to her knees and breathed hard, and held the scanner to her chest, and listened. As the sound outside faded slowly into silence, the AI whispered inside, "Safe for now, unknown entity. Cannot breach sacred ground. Signal stabilizing, preparing interface." And Myra closed her eyes and let her body rest against the cold floor. She had made it, but just barely, and the memory of the creature's eyes stayed in her mind like a brand, and she knew it would not stop, and it would wait and watch and strike again. If it could, but she had reached the core, and now there was hope, and maybe answers, and maybe a way to stop the dying before it was too late. She stood slowly and looked around the chamber and saw strange symbols carved into the walls and a platform in the center that glowed softly like it was waiting for her. Mira walked forward with weak legs and a heart full of fear, and placed a hand on the platform, and the light grew brighter, and the symbols moved, and the floor began to hum. And somewhere deep below the earth, something began to wake. The light from the platform rose in slow waves and wrapped around Myra like warm water, and her feet lifted from the ground, and her body floated above the glowing circle as the chamber shifted and turned. Below her she tried to breathe, but the air was gone, and she tried to speak, but her voice was lost, and the light carried her downward through a tunnel made of pure color and soft vibration. The walls around her showed images from far away and long ago, and she saw the faces of the alien girls, not frozen and still, but laughing and running, and building something that looked like a dream, turned real. Then the dream broke. Flashes of red filled the tunnel, and the laughter turned to screams, and the sky cracked open, and darkness spilled across their cities, and the song in the air was replaced with silence, and Mira fell gently onto a floor made of glass and light. And the chamber she now stood in was wide and open, and filled with hundreds of floating crystals, each one humming with sound and color. A tall shape stood at the center, made of energy and shadow, and it turned slowly toward her, and its voice was both gentle and ancient. And it said, "You are not of us, and yet you are part of us." Now Mira stepped forward and said, "I do not understand. I only wanted to help." And the shape nodded slowly and replied, "The spark has touched the chain, and so the chain recognizes the spark." She looked at the crystals, and each one pulsed when her eyes met them, and her heart felt heavy, because she knew somehow that each one held the mind of one of the sleeping girls outside. They were not just frozen in body, but suspended in thought and trapped in memory. And if the crystals failed, then the minds would die, and the bodies would follow, and all would be lost forever. The shape walked beside her and said the system was perfect, once built to hold the minds safe until the danger passed, but time and damage and silence have broken many links, and now the collapse has begun. She asked, "Can I fix it?" And the shape paused and said, "Perhaps, but to repair the root you must become the root, and the price is high, and the choice must be freely made." Myra looked down and saw one of the crystals glowing weaker than the others, and she reached out and touched it, and a wave of memory flowed into her, and she saw a young alien girl staring at the star. She felt her dreams and her fears, and her love for her people, and her trust in the system that would keep her safe, and her hope that someone would remember them if they did not wake. The memory faded, and Mira pulled her hand back, and her eyes were wet, and her voice shook as she said, "I remember her now, and I cannot let her fade into nothing." The shape said, "The mind core is failing, but the structure still holds. If the spark chooses to bond, it may guide the flow and restore the chain, but the spark will no longer be only itself." Mira felt the truth in those words, and she looked again at the crystals and saw them not as lights, but as lives, and she knew that every moment she waited was another breath lost forever. She whispered, "I am afraid," and the shape replied, "Fear is the sign of care, and care is the first step towards sacrifice, and sacrifice is the seed of hope." The platform rose from the floor again, and the light became a pillar, and the scanner in Mira's hand dissolved into dust, and the AI core gave one final word, "Integrity," stepped onto the light, and spread her arms and closed her eyes, and her thoughts were no longer her own, but part of something larger, and her heart beat in rhythm with thousands of others. The pain came like fire and ice, and thunder and silence, all at once, and her body shook, and her mind stretched, and something deep inside her cracked open. Let the stars flow in, she did not fall. She rose, her memories joined with the others, and her name became part of their names. And her voice echoed across the web of minds, and the signal grew strong again, and the broken links began to heal outside in. The forest, the wind stopped, and the trees lifted their branches, and the clouds parted for the first time in many days, and the first of the sleeping girls opened her eyes inside the core. Myra now floated above the chamber, her body glowing with soft blue light, and her heart calm for the first time since the crash, and she whispered, "I am here, and I will not leave." The shape bowed before her, and faded into dust, and the crystals began to sing a soft harmony that reached across the land and touched every sleeper with warmth and life. The choice was made. The price was paid. The chain would hold, and Myra would guide it from within. The sky above the forest turned from deep gray to soft blue, and the wind that once howled now moved gently through the leaves, like a mother brushing the hair of a sleeping child. And something had changed in the air. The grass shimmered with drops of morning light, and the trees stood still, like they were listening. And far across the hills, the circle of frozen girls stood just as before, but not quite the same one. Girl blinked, her fingers twitched, and her lips parted, and her chest pulled in a long, soft breath, and she looked up at the sky with eyes that held the weight of forgotten time, and the warmth of return. Then another girl moved, and another, and soon the sound of breath filled the clearing, and the silence that had ruled for so long stepped aside and let life return like water to dry stone. Myra did not see this with her eyes, but she felt it in her heart and her mind. Now part of the great web, and she hovered within the mind core like a flame that would not go out. Her body rested inside the tower, her hands open, her face calm, and her eyes closed. But inside her mind she stood among stars and thoughts and voices, and she heard every girl wake one by one. The pain of the merge was gone now, and in its place was peace, not silence, not stillness, but the feeling of being part of something whole and alive and full of light. She walked among the minds, and they welcomed her with soft voices and old songs and pieces of memory, and they called her sister and guardian and spark and root, and she did not turn away. The system that once held them had cracked, but with her in the center, it now breathed again, and the code that had fallen apart began to rewrite itself. With each new pulse of shared thought, she sent a signal through the web, and it reached the girl who had first fallen, and though her body was lost, her memory returned, and the others held it close so it would never fade. Again Myra saw their faces in the web, young and bright and strong and full of wonder, and they reached back through the link and offered her their names and their songs and their trust. Outside, the forest grew quiet as the awakened girls looked around and stepped forward with slow grace and wonder, and they reached for each other and smiled, and the ground beneath them grew warm. The creature that had hunted her returned to the edge of the forest and watched in silence, but it did not enter, because the old law still held, and the sacred ground was now truly alive. The tower that had once been silent now hummed like a living heart, and the vines that once covered it turned to flowers that glowed with soft blue light, and the walls pulsed with rhythm like breath. Myra stood in the center of it all, not as a stranger, not as a visitor, but as part of the living chain that now stretched across the land and sky and sea and time. The AI that had once spoken to her was gone, now its voice quiet and its data scattered into the system, but its final act had been enough to carry her this far, and she felt no anger, only thanks. The circle of girls outside looked toward the tower, and some of them fell to their knees, and others reached for the sky, and all of them felt her presence like sunlight on skin and memory on breath. She spoke to them, not with words but with feeling, and they understood, and their hearts answered, and the link grew stronger and brighter, and the world itself seemed to breathe once more. She was not human anymore, not fully, but she was not lost either. And the girl who had crashed alone into this silent world was now the voice of a people, and the soul of a system. Myra's name would not be forgotten, and her story would be sung through the link, and passed from mind to mind, and remembered, not as one who came to conquer or flee, but as one who chose to stay. She walked the inner world now, where thought flows like rivers, and memory grows like trees, and stars fall like snow, and every path leads to a song, and every door opens to light. She was awake, the girls were awake, and the silence was broken. The forest would grow again, and the towers would rise, and the voices would sing, and the chain would hold, and the spark would guide, and the root would live, all because one girl chose not to run